Yesterday about providence, divine providence. And I introduced the idea that there's a difference between control, management, and causality on the one hand. That's how providence operates, versus the purpose for which providence operates. And I suggested that how providence operates is equal for everything. Every detail of the career of every item, whether it's a human being or a cat or a blade of grass, divine control, management, and causality is the same for all. It's the same for all because there's no alternative. There are only particular things in the world. So, for example, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a commitment that there should be dogs until the Messiah comes, the only way to engineer that is that the world is set up in such a way that individual dogs reproduce, individual ones, one at a time, and they keep reproducing so that in the end they won't die out. So in that respect, that this dog reproduces when and how is no different from that person gets a reward when and how. Because the only way that you can have dogs reproduce is by operating somehow on the individuals. But when you ask about the purpose for which providence is exercised, then you get radically different answers. Can be that, in almost all cases, the providence that causes, manages, individual dogs is for the sake of there being dogs in the world, and that's all. For that sake, although the system that's set up caused this dog to reproduce at this time, another system which had caused a different dog to reproduce at that time would have been just as good. There is a system, and it caused this one specifically to reproduce at this time, but it didn't have to. Doesn't serve any divine purpose that it should be this one rather than that one. When it comes to human beings, the purposes for which divine providence interacts with human beings are very often, not always again, very often, purposes that are unique to the individual. It's for the sake of this individual that divine providence did for him what it did. And we gave the grand example of reward and punishment. Reward and punishment, by definition, is individual. Each one gets the result of his own actions. So each one's reward and punishment providence is something which is for him particularly, unlike the providence for dogs and blades of grass. Now, within human beings, there are also different purposes, and not all the purposes apply equally to all people. And I mentioned the purpose of preservation, which the Rambam says, and Nachmanides also says, and the Ramchal will also agree. The purpose of preservation applies to great tzaddikim, great, holy, righteous people. They're the ones that deserve this kind of divine protection. And other people don't. So here it distinguishes between different types of people, different types of providence that they get. So when you hear someone saying, this group gets and that group doesn't get, it's crucial to ask yourself, get what? Management and causation, reward and punishment, preservation, something else. You have to ask yourself whether it's the fact of control versus a purpose, and if it's a purpose, which purpose is it? Without filling in precisely what it is you're talking about, you can't make sense out of the proposition. Now, I told you that the Rambam believes in individual providence, and I think it's it's incontrovertible. I'm writing something on that subject at the present time. But here's a thought that some people offer to counteract the idea. In the commentary on the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avos, where it says that on the sixth day of creation, just towards evening, In a period called Bein HaShmoshos. Bein HaShmoshos is between the 2 days. It's like a combination of the features of both days. And this is like Friday afternoon going into Shabbos. 10 things were created. And the 10 things are all things that require some kind of miraculous event to occur. Bilam's talking donkey, or the splitting of the sea, or whatever it is. Now, Maimonides on that Mishnah says, don't make a mistake. Don't think that Mishnah is telling you only these 10 were created then. No. All events, all objects, all features that play a role in miraculous events later in history were created at that time. They were all created at that time. So now the naive, incautious reader says, oh ho, so really there aren't any miraculous interventions in the world. It isn't that God split the sea. No, he programmed into the world the splitting of the sea in the 6 days of creation. Was already set up before the end of the 6 days of creation. So it sounds like from then on, the world just rolls on. It rolls on with all the programming that it got in the 6 days. And then, since it rolls on without divine intervention, they say, well, without divine intervention, it's natural. So you see nature progressing along, and you see that the Rambam is telling you that from the end of the 6 days of creation onwards, nature rules. Nature rules. There are no, listen carefully, miraculous interventions in the world to change the course of events. Now, that it's true that Maimonides says that on the commentary in the Mishnah. In the Guide of the Perplexed, he says something different, which I'm not going to go into at the moment, but he says that later miraculous interventions do take place. On the surface, it's a contradiction. And although you might say, well, then his considered opinion is with the later work, because you usually give the later work precedence over the earlier work, you say he changed his mind. But, as a matter of fact, the Rambam re-edited his commentary on the Mishnah throughout his life. He even inserted editing into the commentary of the Mishnah after he wrote the Guide of the Perplexed. We know that. We have the manuscripts. And this he didn't change. This statement in the commentary of the Mishnah, which says no miraculous interventions after the 6 days, he did not change. So we're left, all of this I'm taking from Rabbi Meisel. So we're left with a puzzle. What did he mean? Did he see somehow that there wasn't a contradiction that we're missing? Or what? And I don't know what to say about it. But I want to talk about what he says in the commentary in the Mishnah straight, because that is the one which is designed to make the most trouble. And if we can satisfactorily explain that, then I think that we don't have to worry about weaker propositions. So, here's the statement which says that after the end of the 6 days of creation, no miraculous interventions. If there are no miraculous interventions, then the critic says, so that means there's no miracles. That's what he says. Might not be right, but that's what he says. No miraculous interventions means no miracles. Okay? No miracles means it's all nature. And if it's all nature, blind causation, surely you can't have individual providence. Individual providence requires intelligence. It requires knowledge. It requires power to orchestrate the events according to, let's say for human beings, the actions that they perform. So it must be that he denies individual providence. Or at least in that passage, because you can't ignore the passages that I cited. So then he'll say, okay, so he contradicts himself. But it's a mistake. The logic is a mistake. And here's the reason. when he programmed into the 6 days of creation, and in particular in Ben Hashmashos, the transition time from Friday afternoon to Shabbos, he programmed in all the future miracles that are going to take place. So that after that, it goes on automatic pilot. How did he decide what miracles to program into what places? Let's take the splitting of the sea. Did he program it by flipping a coin and saying, oh, I guess it'll be on, the 16,000th Tuesday in the afternoon? And it just happened by accident that the Jewish people were there, and the Egyptian army was bearing down on them, and the mountains were trapping them from the sides, and they had no escape, and suddenly the sea opens up, and they go across. It was just an accident. Just a lucky guess, or a lucky accident. Of course not. Because Baruch Hu used his foreknowledge of what's going to happen otherwise, and he programmed in the splitting of the sea so as to compensate for the danger that the Jews would be facing at that time. He used his foreknowledge. Bilam's donkey, the rest of them, all of them are based on the fact that certain events are going to occur, and if left to their own devices, they're going to develop this way. And I'm going to put in an event, sure, at the end of the 6 days of creation, I'm going to put an event for that time, for those circumstances, so as to make sure to develop in the way that I want them to develop. Okay, so now, it seems to me if you're there, you're standing there at the Red Sea, and you see the Egyptians bearing down on you, and there are mountains on both sides, and you think, I'm dead. There's no way out. And then Moses says, you're not dead, because God is going to split the sea to save you. And you say, really? Really? He says, yes, watch. And Nachshon jumps into the water starts to split, you go across. You say, well, Moses is right. God saved me because he knew I was going to be here. He knew I was in mortal danger, and he, thousands of years ago, programmed into the world the splitting of the sea so as to save me now. Now, once you have that in your mind, do you feel abandoned to the blind forces of nature? Do you feel that God is uncaring and uninvolved and uncommitted to your career and to the importance of your life because he stopped causing things at the end of the 6 days of creation? I don't think you should. I think you should feel that he cares so much that he used his knowledge of the future thousands of years later so as to program into the creation something that will happen at that time for that purpose. What difference does it make whether he, so to speak, causes a change in the otherwise flow of the world at the moment so as to save you, or whether he used his foreknowledge from thousands of years before to see, oh, my children are going to be in trouble over there, so I'm going to prepare for them for salvation? What difference does it make? The thought process of the Creator takes you and your circumstances into account and programs the world in such a way that it will respond to you in exactly the way that's right. So if we're talking about whether you should understand, should feel connected, should feel cared for, should feel that the Kodesh Baruch Hu has a direct involvement in your life, I don't think it matters whether he presses the buttons now or he pressed the buttons 1,000 years ago. If you know 1,000 years ago he's looking at where you are now and he took that into account, then you know that he's responding to where you are and what you're doing. So I think that this is certainly not a contradiction to individual divine providence. And then, as I hinted before, I said the step 1 to step 2 of the critic is also wrong, because the step 1 was from the end of the 6 days of creation, there are no more miraculous interventions in the world. And he went on to say, well, if there are no more miraculous interventions, there are no more miracles, but that's not right. Not according to the Rambam's definition. The Rambam's definition of nature is that which always happens, or almost always happens. When you hold a rock that weighs a pound and let go, it almost always falls to the ground. Not in a hurricane, but otherwise it falls to the ground. Nature is what happens, always or almost always. The fact that he programs the splitting of the sea into the world thousands of years before, and it happens afterwards because of the programming, doesn't make it natural. It doesn't fit the Rambam's definition of natural. The fact that it's programmed before, two different types of events are programmed from before. Some are natural events because they are repetitive, and some are supernatural events because they're not repetitive. Supernatural doesn't mean stirring the soup now. Supernatural means not repetitive, not expectable, not something you can anticipate. So even according to the Rambam's own definition of what nature is, they're not natural. So this as an argument that the Rambam must deny divine providence because all of the miracles were programmed into the world at the end of the sixth day of creation is just a double logical mistake. It's a double logical mistake. Questions on this? Yeah.
Supernatural, doesn't that literally translate to above nature?
Right.
So, we're saying that we're saying that anything that is supernatural is something that will not occur as expected. Doesn't that take on a different meaning?
Two phrases with a different meaning can refer to the same reality.
I mean, they'll have the same. They can have the same result, which is something completely abnormal, like a mountain.
Listen, there's a fellow named Joe who's married to a woman named Jill, and their last name is Biden. He's her husband. There's a fellow named Joe whose last name is Biden, who's president of the United States. He's the husband of Jill and the president of the United States. They don't say the same thing. They don't mean the same thing, but they're the same person. There are lots of things you can say about nature, lots of things you can say about miracles. They're not all the same words, they're not all the same concepts, but they refer to the same thing. So I don't see why, if it doesn't mean the same thing, it's somehow some kind of contradiction. The very same item that you're talking about has many features, and you can talk about the different features. They're all true. They're all true, and they all contribute to understanding the item. I'm not hearing good. Maybe you should think about it and see if you can make the question clearer.
Okay. I have another question.
Yeah.
I was saying that God pre-programmed the world in order to see whatever dangers that the Jews will face in the future.
I don't think you mean the words you're saying. He sees it with his foreknowledge. Foreknowledge has nothing to do with programming. You could be just a spectator and know what's going to happen in the future. He used his foreknowledge of what, and I was very careful the way I said it because otherwise you end up in an obvious contradiction. I said he used his foreknowledge of what would happen if he doesn't intervene, and for the sake of that, he programmed something in the original creation which would change the outcome. He can't use his foreknowledge of what is going to happen, because if it is going to happen, then changing it is out of the picture. But that's actually what's going to happen. No, I said what would happen without programming something, and then he says, okay, if I don't program something in, this is what's going to happen. I don't want that to happen, so I'll program something in so that it won't happen. I mean, we do that all the time, don't we? If there's a heavy rainfall, the dam is going to break. Let's have some more cement. So it won't break.
Hashem was planning for something that he knew that was going to happen, but he didn't want. But he could have. Again,
he didn't know that it will happen. He knew that if he doesn't program something else into the creation, it will happen. That will happen. Under the assumption that I don't do anything, I don't add to the creation, it will happen. So I'm going to add to the creation, so it won't happen.
So that means that the Jews are acting on their own will.
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. Yeah.
I don't know if this is too tangential, but can you maybe elucidate the, Nachshon went into the Yam, and that caused the nace to happen, let's say, one of the causative effects. So Hashem had to kind of take into account Nachshon's choice before he said, yes, let's do the nace there, right?
No.
So,
No. The fact that A causes B does not imply that if A doesn't happen, B won't happen. Because something else could cause B.
right, so it's more...
So,
similar
but
to,
then your question doesn't work, right? Because he doesn't have to take it into account. He can say, I've got 1,000 alternatives, and if this one chooses not, that one will do it. Yeah, I just have to guarantee somehow that one of the 1,000 will work. That's like the ultimate gula, same thing. But people often make this mistake. They confuse the necessary condition with the sufficient condition. A caused B means A made it happen. You know, it's like a firing squad. So you got 10 guys with guns, all shooting at the same guy. Right? Now, one bullet got there first and killed him. If that bullet hadn't killed him, would he be alive? No, because there were another 9 coming. So he definitely would have been dead. So the fact that A causes B doesn't imply that if you don't have A, B won't happen. I think that's what you need for your question.
So,
Yeah?
So that's similar to, I guess, like Mordechai with Esther. Like, if you don't go petition Nachashverosh, then
Right?
right, okay.
But you're going to be lost. Yes.
There's a Gemara that says, like, once a baby is, like, after 40 days, then I think you can't daven to change the gender, because it's already set, right? So I always thought that, let's say when we pray for rain to happen, so since it's not set yet, therefore you're allowed to pray for it, because it's not really changing anything now, it's just going to change something in the future. But according to this, everything's already, like, set. So, like, when you're praying for things to change, even future events, it's already set. So what's the difference between the baby and everything else?
Because it can be set on the grounds that he knows you're going to pray. As I said before, he takes into account the actions that you perform. And by the way, not changing for the. I mean, Dina did pray that it was a boy, and prayed to change it to a girl. So there you're reading about the rules of tefillah, the rules of prayer. Kodesh Baruch Hu can make miracles. You're not supposed to pray for miracles, but it can happen. And in exceptional cases, it does happen, like this case, like Dina's case, right?
So when is it considered Tefillah Shav and when is it not?
The halacha says so, and you have to have an explanation of why you cannot. In other words, because the Gemara is over there, the Mishnah in Bracha says you hear them yelling in the city, and you say, "Please let it not be my house." But it's happened already. It's happened already. In the case of the sex of the child, maybe the child is male at 6 months. That doesn't mean the Kodesh Baruch Hu can't make the male into a female. We're not asking him to change the last 6 months. We just want to make sure that it won't be a boy because you don't want to have 7 boys. Right? It's not the same thing. Yeah.
If it's already preset, how do I have the choice, say, to pray for rain? If it's already preset to rain, if I don't pray and it does rain anyway, is there a contradiction there, or am I? It seems to me as almost I'm being forced to pray for rain because it will rain.
It's preset to rain because you are going to pray for it to rain.
If the choice is truly mine.
Yeah, that's right. And God knows what you choose. He can see beforehand what you choose, and He knows that that's what you're going to choose, and therefore He proclaims it to rain.
And there's no situation in which, well, if I don't pray and it does rain, there's no possibility that happens because He knows I'm going to do it.
Well, let's be careful with our language. You can ask, if I hadn't prayed, in the real world I prayed. That's what the real world is. Now let's talk about a virtual world. That's unreal. In the virtual world, which I don't pray, could be that it wouldn't rain. That could be. But as a matter of fact, in the real world, I did pray. And He knew I was going to pray because He knew my choice that I was going to make. The only question you can ask is, if He knows the choice you're going to make, is it really a free choice? That's a good question. The Mishnah mentions it. Our Rishonim and Achronim talk about it. I've lectured on it a number of times. It's all recorded.
It's discussion from what we're discussing here.
Well, I don't know. If people want to hear about it, I'm happy to do it. It's something which... how many would like to hear about foreknowledge and free choice? Huh? Yeah? Okay. So let's do that. Maybe it'll take the rest of the hour, but it's a standard thing. So here's the thought. God knew yesterday what I'm doing today. Could I really make a free choice if he already knew yesterday what I was going to choose? Now, it's very important to state the problem carefully. The Rambam does this in the Mishnah Torah very carefully. And here's how it works. When I make a free choice, it seems to me I could do A and I could do B. They're both within my power. And it's my choice to determine which I will do. And I think about it for a while, and I choose B. That's the way it seems to me. But the critic will say, look, Rabbi, yesterday already God knew that you're going to do B. Well, could you really have done A? Let's think. If yesterday he knew B, your doing A today would contradict what he knows. Can you really do something that contradicts God's knowledge? Do you even have the power to do something which contradicts God's knowledge? Surely not. God's knowing yesterday that you're going to do B means you don't even have the power to do A. If you don't have the power to do A, then you made a mistake. You don't really have two alternatives. You can't really choose between A and B. A's out. A's erased. So you're not making a choice between two alternatives. And it could be said, and if you're not making a choice between two alternatives, then you're not making a free choice. That's the argument of the critic. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s of the 20th century, philosophers struggled with this, how to formulate the problem. In the end, they came up with the Rambam formulation. Not that they read the Rambam, of course. Why should they waste it? Excuse me. But that they came up with. So this is the problem. Listen again. The problem of foreknowledge is not, yesterday he knew I was going to do B, and I do B, so somehow his knowing yesterday that I'm going to do B forces me to do B, causes me to do B, pushes me to do B. That's not the problem. His knowledge has no effect on my doing B at all. His knowledge that I'm going to do B erases A. That's what it does. It takes away the alternative. And that means I wasn't making a choice between two alternatives. That's the problem. Now this problem has a solution and a dissolution. I got this wrong for many years. I'm sure there are recorded old tapes of mine in which I got it wrong. I found the tshuva of the Rivosh, who is a much better philosopher than I am, and he explained it carefully. By the way, it has nothing to do with being outside of time. That's no help at all. That's no help at all, even though some of our Sfarim talk about it, but the Rivosh is quite clear about that. It's no help at all. And here's the way the solution works. This argument that I presented in the name of the critic has a false move. It has a false move. And if you just identify the false move and ask yourself to try to say the argument differently, you'll see that the argument falls apart. I'm going to say the argument again. I'll point out to you this time where the false move is. So, I think I'm choosing between A and B. I think I freely chose B. Now, God knew yesterday already that I'm going to choose B. Okay? Then the question is, do I really have the power to do A, since doing A would contradict God's knowledge yesterday that I'm going to do B? Let's think about that last sentence. We're asking about, do I have the power to do B? What world are we in? In the real world, I did B. I'm sorry, I have the power to do A. That's where I have the power to do A. In the real world, I did B. My real world, the world that actually exists, has B in it. So when I ask, do I have the power to do A, I'm not asking about this world. I ask about another world. What about another world in which I do A instead of B? But now, if I'm asking about another world in which I do A, is that a consistent world? Is it a coherent world? Who told me I can transfer from the real world to that world God's knowledge of B? Who says when I look at that other world and ask whether I can do A, God's knowledge in that world has to be the same as God's knowledge in this world? Why not say it this way? In the real world, I did B. In the real world, yesterday, I did, and the God knew that I was going to do B. Would it be possible for there to be another world in which I do A, and yesterday he knew A? That's the alternative world. The alternative world is where I do A, and yesterday in that world he knew A. Hold on. Anything wrong with that world? Any kind of contradiction in that world? None at all. The only contradiction arises when you go from the real world in which I do B, and in which yesterday God knows that I'm going to do B. You go to the alternative world and say, well, what about the world in which I do A? And you transfer God's knowing B into the other world. And then you say, look, doing A and his knowing B is a contradiction. But who told you to make that transfer? So that's the fallacy. The fallacy is in automatically assuming that when you create that virtual world and you're asking, is it a consistent world? Is it a real possibility? That you transfer the same knowledge. But there's no particular reason for you to transfer the same knowledge. Now that's just pointing out in words where the gap lies. But now let's explain it a little bit. Let's explain it. By the way, one of the people who got this right in the Goyish world was Bertrand Russell, no friend of ours, who said, you want to attack the religious person, don't use this argument, because this argument has an easy solution. Now here's the way he put it, and this will make it very intuitive, and then I'll go back and put it into the logic again. How does God get his knowledge about my doing B today? How does he get it? How does he achieve it? How does he acquire it? We never asked that question. God is God. He knows everything. End of story. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. Let's ask. How does he get his knowledge yesterday that I'm going to do A today? How about this as a possibility? He takes a sneak peek at the future. We're limited. We see only in the present. But he, because he's God, isn't limited that way. Standing yesterday, he takes a peek at his tomorrow, which is our today. He takes a peek at tomorrow, and he says, there's Gottleib over there. What's he going to do, I wonder? Let's watch and see. He does B. That's what he does, hey? And now, yesterday, he knows what I'm going to do tomorrow by watching me. Surely that doesn't contradict my freedom. He got his knowledge from watching what I do. When you observe my actions, you don't contradict my freedom, you don't take away my freedom. You only erase the other alternative of A just by watching what I do. And it's very interesting that in the Hebrew literature on the subject, the verbs of God's knowledge of the future are all verbs of observation. Tzofa, Ra'ah, he saw. Very interesting that it uses these verbs. So if I use this model for God's knowledge, now let's make it abstract. This is what the Rivash does. The question is whether his knowledge of what I do is brought about by my doing it. It's a result of my doing it. That's what observation means. I do it, and because I do it, he knows it. Even if it's yesterday, if his knowledge is brought about because I do it, then his knowledge is not going to be any barrier for my choice to be free. Only if his knowledge is not brought out by what I do will you have a problem. So let's go back through it again. In the real world, I do B. And yesterday in the real world, he knew I was going to do B. Now we're imagining another possible world. I want to see if it's possible or not, whether we get in trouble or not. In this other world, I do A. If his knowledge of what I do depends upon what I do, so in that world, for sure, yesterday he knew A, because that's what I did. If his knowledge derives from my action, then in that world that I do A, yesterday he knows A. And if that's so, there's no contradiction whatsoever. Only if you paint God's knowledge as independent of my action, could you generate a contradiction. And this means that being outside of time makes no difference at all. Because outside of time, God's outside of time, and his knowledge is non-temporal. So you think of it noun-wise, not verb-wise. His knowledge includes all facts. You could ask the same question. Is his knowledge outside of the world dependent upon my action or not? Does my action make any contribution to that knowledge or doesn't it? And if you say that his knowledge of my action depends upon my action, then there's no contradiction. And if you say not, then there is a contradiction. Putting God outside of time helps not at all. The only thing that helps is whether his knowledge depends upon my choice or doesn't depend upon my choice. This is a solution to the problem, assuming you can tolerate the idea that God's knowledge will depend upon my choice. Yeah.
I disagree with you on the issue of time. I think if God can see something time bound, then within time, he saw yesterday what you're doing today because he can observe it as you do it, even though it's yesterday. That essentially, because of that, he can see it yesterday, as we discussed before. It takes away the option. If you say you're doing B, it takes away the option of A. But if it's outside of time, he can see you do it independent of any time, knowing before and during, and it doesn't take away the option.
What you're assuming is that no present event can have an effect on the past. You're leaning past as if it's over and finished and untouchable.
That is how time works, is it not?
But you understand? No, it doesn't work that way. And in physics, you have experiments which don't work that way. In fact, so said John Wheeler and Feynman.
You know you can change the past.
That's right. No, you can't change the past. No, listen carefully. They're making a mistake. Listen, you'll learn something. You can't change the past and you can't change the future either. You can't change the past and you can't change the future. Because change means that at one time it was this way and another time the same thing was another way. That's what change means. If we're talking about an event at a time, you can't change it. Only one event happens. And what happens, happens. So no such thing as changing the past. The question is not changing. The question is causing. You can cause what happens in the future. And according to this picture, you can cause what happens in the past also. This is not a matter of time, it's a matter of causation. It's what's called backwards causation. You can look it up. And there are certain interactions in quantum mechanics which are interpreted by Richard Feynman and by John Wheeler as an event now being the cause of an event, a prior event, certain types of decay. Right? So the idea of the present causing the past is not ruled out by logic.
So that makes sense. It's quite simply, as soon as I make the decision in the present, that causes Hashem in the past to know.
Exactly. That's what Bertrand Russell said.
Oh, really?
Okay, think again what he said. He said, God yesterday looks ahead and sees what I do today. So isn't it my action today that's causing his knowledge yesterday? That's exactly what Bertrand Russell said. This is not a new idea. I said it 6 minutes ago.
I didn't write down the quote.
Okay, that's exactly what Bertrand Russell said. And so this is the way that you can solve the problem if you tolerate the idea that God's knowledge can be dependent upon what we do. Now, the truth is that the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah doesn't take this way out. He says something that's tied up with his general philosophy. And interestingly, people don't typically quote this, but in Part 3, Chapter 17, he's talking about a certain school of Arabic philosophy, and he says, by the way, they believe that God knows everything, including the future, and they believe that we have free will, and a little thought will show you that that's a contradiction.
That's what the Rambam.
Yes, the Rambam says, a little thought will show you that it's a contradiction. That's why I said 20 minutes ago that there are two approaches. There's a solution, and there's a dissolution. There's a way to dissolve the problem. The Rambam dissolves the problem. The Rambam's understanding of how things work makes it impossible to formulate the problem. It makes it impossible to raise the problem. Because the Rambam's picture is that there are no literally true statements about God at all. At all. Not even that he exists, not even that he's one. There are no literally true statements about God at all. And of course that means it's not literally true that he knows anything. Of course, it's also not literally true that he's ignorant of anything. That's also not true. There are no literally true statements about God at all. So if the problem is a contradiction between God's knowledge and free will, you can't raise it because God's knowledge is not acceptable. It's not acceptable. All descriptions of God are descriptions of what he does, not what he is. All descriptions that sound like the descriptions of what he is have to be translated into descriptions of action. And then you're not going to have a contradiction. There's no contradiction between action and your free will, and a contradiction between knowledge and your free will. So that's why, because, and I believe, the reason is because of what I said a moment ago, The Rambam will not accept the idea that God's knowledge should be dependent upon your action. The Rambam, at least 5 times in the guide, says that we do not tolerate the idea that God is acted upon, that something causes some feature of God. And he says it in 2 different ways, which he distinguishes. One is we don't want God to change. But in addition to that, not just change, but also he's not the sort of thing that others can act upon and bring about, even eternally bring about some feature of God. So now, he's not going to tolerate the idea that our actions cause God's knowledge. So then the Rivash says, if that's so, you are stuck with a contradiction. And the Rambam's way out is to say, I don't believe one of the conjuncts is something you could say, and therefore the problem dissolves. Those are the 2 different approaches to the problem that I know of in our literature. Yeah.
Doesn't that, the Rambam statement of saying there are no absolute statements you can make about God, go against the 13 principles of faith? Some of them saying God is one. You have to believe that God is one. How can you even say that and believe it if it's not absolute according to the Rambam?
First of all, you used the word absolute, and I did not. I didn't mention the word absolute once, not once. The whole evening, and we have a recording. You can check it. I didn't use the word absolute once the whole evening.
I'm not stating you did.
But then you're formulating what I said. You formulated what I said, and you used the word I didn't say. So I'm pointing that out. Okay, I hope so. Otherwise, education is going to be difficult. But now I said that statements that sound like they are describing what God is are translated into statements describing what God does. So it's not as if you reject them, you re-understand their meaning. And that goes on in Torah literature all the time because it's a complex system. It contains within it superficial contradictions which are only resolvable if you understand how to define the relevant concepts. And there are, by the way, this is part 1, chapter 54 in the guide, if you want to read about it, in the Guide of the Perplexed. That's his great philosophical work. Part 1, chapter 54, where he does this in great detail. It's worth reading several times. So, so that means that the problem is one, if you have a solution, and a dissolution is a problem you don't lose much sleep over. And this, I think, justifies the 4-word description of the problem in the Mishnah, called Safui Rashus Nasuna. Everything is foreseen, perception verb. That supposed means to see, to foresee. Everything is foreseen, and power is given. Power is given, even though everything is foreseen. So, the foreseen in the Mishnah, either you could take it the way the Rivash takes it, in terms of our actions causes knowledge, and therefore it's not a problem. Or you read it the way the Rambam would have to read it, and that is not really talking about his seeing and knowing, because that would be a direct description of what he is. We have to translate it into actions, description of his actions. By the way, the author of the book that we are studying, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, wrote a Kabbalistic work called Klolim Rishonim, and the first page he describes what are spheros. You probably have heard of spheros. And he says spheros are principles of divine action. And he gives a list of the kinds of attributes that we usually associate with God, like just, like merciful, like kind. And he says they are descriptions of the way in which God acts. This is a Kabbalist talking. And on that page, he says twice, and one of these qualities, which is really a description of his action, is divine knowledge. Now, for the alert reader, that should come as a little bit of a shock. Knowledge is a description of action. Justice, I understand. People get what they deserve. Kindness, I understand. People get some benefits that they don't deserve. You can describe what happens from justice, what happens from kindness. How do you describe what happens from knowledge? I think the answer, this is now the only thing I'm saying tonight, which is really mine. I think the answer is this. You ask yourself, what difference does this supposed quality make for action? In what way would a person's actions be affected by his knowledge? The more knowledge you have, if you have absolute perfect knowledge, what effect would that have on your actions? It would mean that every action is coordinated with every other event in the best possible way. So now what we say is, don't talk about God knowing. God's knowing is off bounds. But the action that he does are coordinated with everything else in the best possible way. And finally, if you want just a tiny hint of what it means to say that God can't be described, I would give you two analogies. You go back in time 200 years, and you take with you yourself an MP3 memory plus a couple of speakers. You're talking to these people in English, right? In America or England. And then you say, would you like to hear some music? And say, sure. And you started playing. They look at it in astonishment. Let's say you're playing violin music. And they ask you, the speakers are this big, right? How did you get the violin and the violinist into the box? How did you do that? You say, there's no violinist in the box. No, you can't fool us. We know what that sounds like. We know what produces that. What produces that is violins. Violins and people. That's how it's made. But how did you get him into the box? I think you say to him, you know, where you are in terms of your knowledge and your understanding, it would take me 2 years to explain to you the truth. Right now, you can't understand it. If I speak to you for an hour, I'll just be speaking words that are like Chinese. You can't understand how this thing works. And if it's made in a synthesizer, there never was a violin recording it. It's just synthesized tones, which sound like a violin. Today, if you ask someone who teaches quantum mechanics or does research with quantum mechanics, what is light? What is light and how does it work? The answer is, it's a mystery. Nobody knows. We can tell you what the effects are of doing experiments on light, but what the light is and how it makes it do that. So right now, we don't know what light is. A fellow philosopher, I won't mention his name, wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. The reviewer in one of the journals said a better title would have been Consciousness Ignored. He thinks he explained what consciousness is. The other one thinks he didn't address the subject at all. That should indicate that they don't agree on what the subject is. They don't. They don't agree on what the subject is. That means we really don't have an understanding of it, do we? If we can't agree what the subject is, then something's seriously wrong. Yeah, something's seriously wrong. That's the world we live in. Some of the things that we have, we don't understand. And there's no guarantee that we'll come to understand all of them. Is there? Why should we think that the human brain, with its limited computation ability and with its given structure, should be able to solve all problems that are out there? That would be a faith even more fantastic than religion, huh? Even worse than keeping Shabbos. Maybe yes or maybe no. So the idea that there are things beyond our ability to understand is something which we should take quite seriously. The Rambam says, quoting Aristotle, that there are certain problems the human mind is not able to solve. So the reader says, okay, Maimonides, you were 900 years ago, but we got things under control here. You know, we have supercomputers and everything else. Let's hear your problem. Your problem that you say the human mind can't solve. Okay, here's the problem. Is the number of stars even or odd? Answer! Yeah. Answer? When the last estimate was there are 10 to 22 stars, you're going to discover whether it's even or odd? Not likely, hey? Not likely. Maimonides thought that up 900 years ago. Not likely you're going to get it. So when we talk about limitations on the human mind, that shouldn't be taken as a religious excuse, protecting your ignorance, that you're really facing a contradiction which defeats your system. Human ignorance is playing a role all the time. And we make progress and we also lose progress. No one stresses that. Things that were thought to be simple become very complicated and intractable problems. That's going backwards on progress. The cell was supposed to be just a little bit of liquid with no important structure. Now it has thousands of molecular machines and an internal organization that no one can penetrate, and new machines are being discovered all the time. It was supposed to be simple. Turned out to be disastrous. Time. Up until 1965, everybody thought the world had no beginning. It has no beginning, and where it came from is not a pressing question. Since 1965, it has a beginning. So something that was taken for granted, settled in the box, now all of a sudden it became a gigantic problem. So when they talk about scientific progress, they don't talk about anti-progress, which is also going on. Okay, this is a lot of material around the same thing. I hope that the problem of free will is reasonably tractable. Now my policy is, next time I'll start with a review of this, and if there are questions that come up, you have the whole weekend to think about it, read about it, watch videos, get clever arguments, and we'll see what what people come up with.